Over the long history of Russia and the Soviet Union, one theme has been prevalent. They always fall behind their Western peers and require swift modernization. In the 1980s, the once proud Soviet steel industry once again needed to be modernized. At one point, the Soviet steel industry was the envy of the world. From 1947 to 1957, Soviet steel output tripled and many earned a good living. The Soviet economy was in very bad shape in the early 1980s, mostly due to the costly war in Afghanistan, which had been called the Soviet War in Vietnam. This led to the rise of a new leadership in the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was determined to save the Soviet economy. Gorbachev moved forward with this plan to make the factories up to date by doing things like renovating old steel factories, as well as changing 30 million of the old open hearth furnaces with more efficient basic oxygen furnaces. They also planned to double their production of steel. This became known as the 12th of the Soviet Union's 5-year plans. This plan was successful at first, as investments grew by 7.5% in 1986. However, the picture was not as bright for the people of the USSR. Per capita consumption grew by less than 1% that year, partly due to the increase in alcohol prices. Steel was particularly important to the modernization movement because without improved steel production, the USSR could not modernize their machinery. Gorbachev's continued reform effort was stalled by the Soviet political system, and Gorbachev knew that in order to modernize the steel industry, he needed to reform his government. The movement became known as Perestroika. The communist establishment in the USSR did not approve of the economic reforms, and Gorbachev was hoping that political reforms would bring in members who were more open to change. This led to the rise of multiple political parties, though the communists would still control the elections. Though it marked an important moment in the Soviet Union, it was the first time people had a choice in their election. In March 1989, voters in the USSR could choose their legislative body for the first time and crossed off unopposed communist leaders running. This led to 300 seats going to reformers. The Soviet people want full-blooded and unconditional democracy, Gorbachev said about his reforms. This also began a policy of no longer threatening communist nations with military intervention if they failed to remain communist. This became known as the Sinatra Doctrine. Following the reforms of the USSR, leaders in other nations such as Lech Walesa in Poland gained power to fight against communism. Gorbachev's economic reforms weakened the command economy by giving state enterprises more control of their production and led to the government having very little control by the year 1990. However, the command economy was not adequately replaced with another system, which led to weaker production. This eventually led to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. We are witnessing most profound social change, whether in the East or the South, the West or the North. Hundreds of millions of people, new nations and states, new public movements and ideologies have moved to the forefront of history, Gorbachev said. This need for modernization of the Soviet steel industry led to the adoption of political and economic reforms throughout the USSR, and eventually leading to the collapse of the communist state and an end of the Cold War.
Leave it till tomorrow to unpack my case. Honey, disconnect the phone. I'm back in the USSR. You don't know how lucky you are, boy. Back in the US, back in the US, back in the USSR.